Exactly 1 week ago, like down to the minute, I was sitting in a conference room in a hotel in Birmingham, Alabama, with 19 BJ teens and a few staff members. We had just finished a beautiful Shachrit and Torah discussion, and we were joined by Pastor Gwen Webb, who was a teenager herself during the civil rights movement. She led many of her fellow students on a walkout from school to join the Children's Crusade, the protests in Kelly Ingram Park. Maybe some of you saw her in images at the time that appeared in newspapers of her and other young people being shot with water cannons or attacked by police dogs, images that helped bring the civil rights movement to national attention. As she told us her story, Pastor Gwen asked our students to stand in a circle and to cross their arms and hold hands with the people on either side of them. Repeatedly, as she told us her story, she told our students the lesson that she and her friends had learned as they marched out of the 16th Street Baptist Church and into a park full of police officers who are authorized to inflict violence on them. Do not let go of your friend. Whoever is next to you, even if you've never met them before this moment, if they're marching next to you, they're your friend, and you do not let go of your friend. On Monday of this week, we honored the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a religious leader who heard the cry of his people and led them towards greater freedom. Dr. King was a strategist and architect of the civil rights movement, as well as a pastor and a preacher who called on sacred stories to move his people towards justice. But as many of the speakers on this civil rights trip taught us, the movement was bolstered and sustained by young people, many of them the same age as our 8th and 9th graders on this trip, who saw the darkness of their own world and came together to make change. The civil rights movement was, in many ways, a success. The awareness and activism it generated helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It gave momentum to end segregation and to integrate schools and businesses and communities. But as we drove around Alabama, we learned about and remembered that people of color in America are still subject to increased and excessive surveillance, to police violence, to incarceration, even to modern-day lynchings. One of our speakers, Mr. Curtis Carrington, was 13 years old when he was beaten by Alabama state troopers on Bloody Sunday, and still he returned several days later to the Edmund Pettus Bridge to march with Dr. King towards Montgomery. But when Curtis learned that our students are Jewish, he said his heart broke for them. Yes, for the anti-Semitism they face, and also because they go to school and do lockdown drills regularly, preparing to protect themselves in case of a school shooting. It was so hard for me to be rooted in the stories of these speakers who were children in the 1950s and 60s, when I felt so hopeless that our children could or would get a better world today. This week, our Parsha recounts the final 3 plagues, which escalate from locusts to darkness to the death of every firstborn Egyptian. In a time where it feels like we read about modern-day plagues every day in the newspaper, as we brace ourselves here in New York City for another storm of the century that threatens to destroy crops and homes and disrupt everyday life, we might feel like the Parsha hits closer than home than usual this week. When we read this story this week, when we tell this same story to our children around the Seder table, our attention is naturally drawn to the final plague, the plague of death, both because it seems so much more severe than the others, and because we know it's the climax of the story, the 10th out of 10 plagues that God effects to the natural world. But in thinking about the Parsha this week, I felt my heart catch in my throat before the final plague. At the very beginning of this week's Parsha, Moshe and Aaron once again come to Pharaoh to ask for the Israelites' freedom, and once again Pharaoh refuses them. But before the plague of locusts is announced, Pharaoh's advisors, who have been supportive of him up until this moment, say to Pharaoh, "Don't you know that Egypt is lost? When are you going to let up?" And as we know, Pharaoh doesn't relent until his own son dies, and his entire country is filled with wails of grief. It is so frustrating to watch this cycle of Pharaoh relenting and then considering compromise, and then hardening up as soon as things smooth over. The Midrash in Shmot Rabbah teaches that this is the way of the wicked, that when they are in trouble, they affect humility, but as soon as they have respite, they return to their ways. We see in this week's Parsha a lesson that we know to be true. We too live in a world that we are plagued by wicked leaders, or leaders whose hearts have been hardened. It seems like no amount of bravery, no social movement can permanently shift the arc of history towards justice. I have lost count of how many plagues have struck us over the last decade. Mass shootings, storms that gain supernatural strength because of climate change, immigration raids that echo the terrors of the Holocaust. I have tremendous privilege in this country, and I know I'm often least affected by the things that befall us, and I am still sickened by living in a world of so much suffering. As much as I abhor leaders who refuse to be moved by the suffering of their people, I also fear my own heart hardening by each catastrophe. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote of his involvement with the civil rights movement, morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings, that indifference to evil is worse than evil itself, that in a free society some are guilty, but all are responsible. I wonder if the Egyptians who suffered through these plagues, even as they benefited from the oppression of their neighbors, lost hope that Pharaoh would ever see their suffering and be moved to change. Pharaoh knew what was coming and decided to let it happen. But Pharaoh wasn't the only one affected by the plagues. All the Egyptians were. Their water turned to blood and their houses filled with frogs, and they contracted lice and boils and watched their cattle die and hid from the hail. Some Egyptians were complicit in the oppression of the Israelites, but surely many of them lived far from any Israelites, and yet their land and their bodies suffer just as much, if not more, than Pharaoh. The modern biblical scholar Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg quotes the Italian commentator Sforno, who notes that God hardens Pharaoh's heart to give the Egyptians a chance to recognize God's greatness. The humanitarian point that Sforno makes, Gottlieb Zornberg writes, is that the Egyptians too are being addressed. They remain subjects capable of change. Even if our leaders cannot or will not change, we ourselves can, and we should remain open to being changed by the unbearable circumstances we encounter. Though Pharaoh's heart is hardened, first by his own obstinacy and then by God, Sforno seems to be exhorting us to remain open-hearted. But at some point, our repeated experience of communal fear and suffering becomes too much to reasonably bear. When do you think it was too much for the Egyptians? At the stage of discomfort and inconvenience, when there were frogs everywhere and they itched from lice? When their livelihoods and their food sources were affected by cattle disease and hail and locusts? The Midrash explains that Pharaoh's magicians were broken by the plague of boils, which afflicted them so severely that their bodies were never the same again, and prompted them to push back on Pharaoh before the plague of the locusts. Their own intimate experience of suffering changed their point of view. But as Gottlieb Zornberg writes, Pharaoh is so motivated by his own power, his own narrative of being outside the realm of human suffering, that he suffers from a kind of spiritual rigor mortis and is unable to be moved by the suffering of his people. I see this kind of rigor mortis among our leaders, and it infuriates me, but I also see it setting in our communities and in myself, and it terrifies me. I read this parsha with a sense of dread, knowing the impending doom and tragedy of the death of the firstborn. But as Pharaoh's advisors called out, getting to that point is already having gone much too far. And they're right. The doom arrives before the 10th plague. It comes with the darkness. The plague of darkness is described by the Torah as a complete, tangible darkness. It's not just an unending night. It's a total moratorium on daily life for every single Egyptian. Lo ra'u ish et achiv velo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet yamim. A person could not see his fellow, and for 3 days no one could move about. According to the Midrash, when the darkness fell, people were stuck doing whatever they were doing. If they were standing, they couldn't sit. If they were sitting, they couldn't stand. The rigidity of Pharaoh's heart became literal in their lives. And as his heart hardened against mercy, the air hardened around his subjects, who remained frozen in place by his own obstinacy. No one could comfort their fellow or call out to ask if they were okay. And no one could come together to build a social movement to demand change. The plague of darkness is not just about the physical world, it's a preview of the spiritual state brought on by the final plague. Being unable to see each other or move towards each other is the penultimate plague before death touches each and every household. And we cannot let this happen to us. I sometimes feel like the only way to survive this time in history is to harden my own heart, to retreat into the darkness. It's too hard to read and watch the news. It's too hard to see videos of people abducted from their homes in the dead of winter, wearing nothing but their underwear, to see photos of small children forced into unmarked vehicles. It's too easy to see these patterns of abuse of people of color by people in power. And it's too scary to think that our children will be the ones responsible for rising up. But I will never forget our BJ teens standing arm in arm around Pastor Gwen Webb, singing "We Shall Overcome" as they held tightly to each other, and then as they wept while hugging her. I know Pastor Gwen is right. Whoever is willing to stand next to us, to hold our hands as we march against injustice, they are our friends, and we can never let go of our friends. I am sure that the coming weeks and months will be filled with marches and protests against oppression and violence. I pray that the movement building in Minnesota expands across the country, that we will all be part of a movement that demands an end not only to our own suffering, but of our neighbors, that we will be moved to stand with our other minorities and historically oppressed people as friends and allies. It is a dark time, but I pray that we will face it holding hands with each other. Though the words of Psalm 23 are written about God, I believe they are also true between people. Gam ki elech begetzal mavet, lo irara ki ata imadi. Though I walk through the valley of deepest darkness, I fear no harm, for you are with me. May we be blessed to find friends in the people around us, and may we hold tightly to each other against the darkness. Shabbat shalom.